Tonight, terrorists attacked 2 American hotels in Jakarta. Suicide bombers kill at least 8 people. Dozens more are wounded, including several Americans. I'm Katie Couric. Also tonight, a warning from the president.
If we don't get health care reform done now, then no one's health insurance is going to be secure.
Rising fees, why banks are charging you more for everything from using an ATM to bouncing a check. And Assignment America, she may look sweet enough, but you don't want to mess with Kathleen Harris.
This is the CBS Evening News with Katie Couric.
Good evening, everyone. The attacks were well planned and quite possibly meant to undermine Indonesia's pro-American president, who's made his name fighting terrorists in his country. Authorities say suicide bombers posing as guests set off blasts at 2 American luxury hotels in Jakarta. At least 8 people were killed. More than 50 others were wounded, including 8 Americans. An Indonesian terror network with links to al-Qaeda is suspected. Now, that network was behind a deadly bombing at one of the same hotels 6 years ago. President Obama, who lived in Indonesia as a child, condemned what he called outrageous attacks. The latest now from Terry McCarthy.
A hotel lobby at breakfast time turned into an inferno. Lydia Ruddy, whose own house is nearby, can be seen in this video as she came out to take pictures of the aftermath.
It was very loud. The house shook. So, I thought maybe even the house had been struck by lightning. Unbelievable. It's just absolutely horrible thing to witness.
5 minutes after the first blast at the Marriott, a second bomb ripped through a restaurant in the Ritz-Carlton across the street.
It was just chaos to see the people running away from those 2 buildings.
Guests fled in their bathrobes. Parents carried their children. Bystanders carried the wounded. Luxury hotels patronized by Westerners have become soft targets for terrorists, from Islamabad and Amman to Mumbai and Jakarta.
Hotels, by their very nature, have to be accommodating. You can't make these hotels fortresses. You have to allow the flow of people and goods and vehicles.
Police say the bombers had checked into the Marriott 2 days ago and put their bombs together in their room. After the explosions, a third bomb was found and defused in the hotel. The main suspects, an al-Qaeda affiliate known as Jemaah Islamiyah, which carried out a series of attacks between 2000 and 2005 against hotels and nightclubs across Indonesia. Their deadliest attack was the 2002 bombings in Bali that killed 202 people, most of them foreigners. But there had been no major terrorist attacks in 4 years, and police thought they'd arrested most of its leaders.
It resurrects the question as to whether or not enough has been done to dismantle Jemaah Islamiyah. A couple of individuals, well-armed, well-trained, can do great damage to the sense of security.
Newly re-elected President Yudhoyono said today was a black spot for Indonesia that had been having some success in persuading foreigners it was safe enough to visit. But televised images of a bomb detonating inside a hotel will again sow fear in a country that had hoped it was leaving its past behind. Terry McCarthy, CBS News, Beijing.
Meanwhile, in Washington, President Obama today continued his hard sell for health care reform, but he also had to do a little doctoring, treating a case of sticker shock over the latest proposals for insuring nearly every American. Here's our chief White House correspondent, Chip Reed.
With anxiety surging over the cost of health care reform, the president today sought to reassure the public and nervous members of Congress.
Health insurance reform cannot add to our deficit over the next decade, and I mean it.
His statement comes one day after the congressional budget director sent shockwaves through Capitol Hill, with testimony that the bills now working their way through Congress would send spending on health care soaring.
The legislation significantly expands the federal responsibility for health care costs.
That's exactly the opposite of what the president has repeatedly promised, that health care reform will bend the long-term cost curve downward, a promise he repeated today.
The bill I sign will also include my commitment and the commitment of Congress to slow the growth of health care costs over the long run.
But Republicans say the budget director's prediction that the cost curve will go up means the Democrats' plan will break the bank. Many Democrats are worried, too. About 36 first-term House Democrats today voiced their concerns about cost in a meeting with Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel, a meeting the president dropped by. Members in the meeting say the president seemed open to suggestions but was adamant about passing it this year.
If we don't get health care reform done now, then no one's health insurance is going to be secure.
In another effort to try to keep control of the health care debate, the White House announced today that the president will hold a primetime news conference next Wednesday. Katie?
Chip Reed. Chip, thank you. President Obama's top economic advisor noted today the health of America's big banks has improved. And Larry Summers said that would not have happened without that big injection of taxpayer cash. Two more banks that got bailout money reported a major turnaround today. Citigroup says it earned $3 billion in the second quarter. Bank of America, meanwhile, $2.5 billion. But even though they're back in the black, some banks are raising their fees on customers. Anthony Mason is our business correspondent. And Anthony, if they're showing a profit again, why those aggravating fee hikes?
No kidding. Well, Katie, because while the profits may look good, they're coming from investment banking, the sale of assets, and job cuts. In fact, the consumer side of their business is bleeding red ink.
With mortgage defaults and unemployment still on the rise, the big banks are taking a beating on bad consumer loans. Bank of America said today it's put aside $13 billion to cover mounting losses. Citigroup nearly $4 billion. To offset those losses, banks are hiking fees, even on good customers.
Banks are looking to do much what airlines, state and local governments are doing, and that is fill the revenue gap by boosting fee income.
Mary Gorman found that out after her 48-year-old son died. When she went to close his checking account, Bank of America hit her with a $100 fee.
Well, I just didn't realize that they would charge to close an account. They're taking money from a dead person.
Bank of America later refunded the money, but in June it raised the fee on its basic monthly checking account from $5.95 to $8.95. Among big banks, the average ATM charge is now nearly $2, up from $1.78 just a year ago. The median overdraft charge, which 6 years ago was $20, has jumped to $26 this year, the first time it's increased during a recession. Heather Donato got hit by those higher fees when a bank loan was late being transferred into her account.
So not only was the money for the bills gone, I also had $120 in overdraft fees.
But as job losses are mounting, many borrowers are falling behind on their payments.
The issue is those credit losses continue to rise at an alarming rate.
And analyst Paul Miller believes unemployment could be headed for 11%.
11% unemployment rate is going to cause a lot of problems inside these banks.
The banks want to raise fees now because new restrictions passed by Congress take effect in February. The Fed is also working on new rules on overdraft protection. Katie?
So, Anthony, we have spent billions of dollars trying to stabilize the nation's banks. Are we at least getting there?
The banks are in better shape, but until the unemployment rate stabilizes, they're really vulnerable. Because remember, if unemployment goes up 1%, that's hundreds of thousands of job losses. People who can't meet their mortgage payments, can't pay off their credit cards, can't pay their car loans. Potentially huge losses for the banks still.
All right. Anthony Mason. Thank you, Anthony. In other news, Sonia Sotomayor has won over at least some Republican senators on her way to certain confirmation as the first Hispanic justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. After 4 days of hearings by the Judiciary Committee, Republicans Richard Lugar, Mel Martinez, and Olympia Snowe all said today they will vote to confirm. But Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said he will not. The committee is expected to vote next week, the full Senate early next month. Now moving on to Iran, still in turmoil more than a month after the disputed presidential election. Today, the streets of the capital were again filled with protesters. 15 were arrested. But something remarkable happened as well. A top cleric blasted Iran's leaders, his own peers, for the way they've handled this crisis. Here's Elizabeth Palmer.
Thousands of protesters marched once again through the streets of Tehran in support of the defeated presidential candidate Mir Hossein Mousavi. But they were driven back by police and tear gas. They still want the June election results to be overturned and hoped for a clear message of support from one of Iran's most powerful clerics, Hashemi Rafsanjani. At a packed Friday prayer service, he described the current political instability as a crisis and demanded the release of hundreds of protesters who have been arrested. To Iran's hardline conservatives, this will sound like an attack on the government. But it wasn't enough for the crowd outside. Traitor, they shouted, and death to the dictator. In a sign that the radical phase of this protest may be over, though, their champion, Mousavi, was inside listening, leading to speculation that he will join a new, more moderate opposition.
I don't think it's the style of any of the opposition leaders of the present crisis to come out confrontationally. I think they would tend to go slowly but surely.
That will be disappointing news to the young protesters who still want bigger, faster changes in Iran than any candidate can deliver. Elizabeth Palmer, CBS News, London.
And still ahead here on the CBS Evening News, as the parents of those 17 children, 13 with special needs, are laid to rest, the safe their killers stole is opened. But up next, if they can put a man on the moon, well, should they do it again? It's getting pretty crowded at the International Space Station. The shuttle Endeavour docked there today after doing a backflip, so its heat shield could be examined for possible launch damage. The 7 astronauts then joined 6 others already inside the station, 13 on one spacecraft. That's a record. Endeavour's mission coincides with the 40th anniversary of the very first moon landing, and as NASA looks back with pride, Mark Strassman tells us it's also looking ahead.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
When men first walked on the moon, 500 million people, 1/6 of the Earth's population, watched in awe. For 2 hours, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin explored the lunar landscape.
And now we have 2 Americans on the moon.
It's not beautiful. It's magnificent desolation. Magnificent achievement for humanity.
That achievement provided the raw material for research that continues today in this rarely seen NASA lab. Behind this steel vault door, moon rocks, the building blocks of our solar system, older than rocks on Earth, snapshots of how and when planets and moons were formed.
When they found out this rock was 3.9 billion years, that was a big deal.
Since the Apollo days when this control room came alive, NASA has come a long way. But its mission today is less clear. Is it the moon, Mars, and should humans go at all?
Well, we've got a beautiful picture.
NASA believes the moon is the crucial next step. Its mandate, return people there by 2020.
Ignition, we have ignition.
This time, 2 rockets would launch to carry heavier loads, one carrying astronauts, the other cargo. In low Earth orbit, the capsule carrying the astronauts and the lunar lander would dock. After 4 days of travel, all 4 astronauts would land on the moon. For a week, they would try to learn whether it's possible to live off the land in space. For instance, the moon's poles may contain ice, a possible source of water, oxygen, and hydrogen. Their spacesuits attached to the exterior of the lunar rover. From inside, astronauts could step in or step out of their suits. Jeff Hanley leads NASA's new system of spacecraft called Constellation.
We're trying to go anywhere. We're trying to stay twice as long with twice as many people.
But critics, including the second man on the moon, say NASA must go to places people have never gone before.
That's a little bit different than Neil and Buzz kicking up dust on the moon. I think we owe them something more than that.
Tell me if you got a picture.
Ultimately, America has to make hard choices about how much risk to take and how much we're willing to spend. Just a trip to the moon would cost an estimated $100 billion. As once again, NASA makes the case for space and the next giant leap for man. Mark Strassman, CBS News, Houston.
Back on Earth, an amazing day at the oldest golf championship on the planet. 59-year-old American Tom Watson is tied for the lead at the British Open. Steve Marino, his rival at the top of the leaderboard, was only 3 years old the last time Watson won the tournament. But it was a rough day for Tiger Woods. In fact, he lost his ball in the rough at one point, and he failed to make the cut at a major for only the second time in his career. And when we come back, the funeral for that murdered Florida couple and new developments in the investigation. In the Florida Panhandle today, that couple murdered in their home by a band of thieves was laid to rest. And the investigation took another turn as we found out what was in the safe taken from their home. Don Teague has the latest.
The children of Bird and Melanie Billings joined hundreds of family, friends, and relatives at a Pensacola church today to say goodbye to a couple who devoted their lives to children in need.
Their lives centered around children, their family, and each other. They loved deeply and unconditionally.
8 days after the parents of 17 were murdered in a raid of their home, authorities in Pensacola say their investigation is almost complete. They've recovered the suspected murder weapon, along with a safe stolen from the house, and arrested 8 people.
You see these people? They're trash. I want them all to pay. Every one of them.
Authorities say more arrests could follow. They've brought the Drug Enforcement Agency in on the case, but insist the DEA is investigating the suspects, not the victims. Investigators say the motive appears to have been robbery. The stolen safe was found buried in the backyard of a home owned by Pamela Wiggins, now charged with accessory after the fact to murder. What was in the safe?
Passports, birth certificates, adoption papers.
The sheriff says it's unclear if the suspects knew the contents of the safe or whether they managed to get it open. While the contents of the safe were apparently of little value. Amazing grace. Relatives say something of real value was stolen. The lives of 2 caring parents. Don Teague, CBS News, Pensacola.
Okay. And coming up next, Assignment America, right after this. And finally tonight, no matter what you've heard, you can fight City Hall. So as a public service, a lesson in how to do it in Steve Hartman's Assignment America.
Well, there's only one way I can come down now.
At 92,
it's like this.
Kathleen Harris says steps are supposed to be hard. But sidewalks aren't supposed to be steps.
It's a regular obstacle course.
Mrs. Harris hates uneven sidewalks, specifically the cracks, crevices, and downright cliffs that threaten her safe passage here in Oswego, New York.
My patience ran out.
She says sidewalks became her passion in the summer of 2004.
So that's how I looked.
You look beautiful.
Oh, sure. Black eye.
After tripping on a sidewalk, Mrs. Harris filed a formal complaint, asking the city to pay her $879 medical bill.
In its response, the city told Mrs. Harris that they had no idea this particular piece of sidewalk was uneven. The city said by New York state law, until someone puts it in writing that there's a problem with a specific piece of sidewalk, the city's not liable.
So I said, well, by God, you're not going to be able to hide behind that excuse any longer. You're going to be responsible.
To that end, Mrs. Harris got a ruler and a notepad and began the most ambitious survey of sidewalk cracks ever attempted.
Another one.
We asked her to demonstrate for us how she did it, painstakingly measuring and recording any pieces of pavement that were more than a quarter inch off flush.
And then all these jagged edges, I write that down too.
But even more impressive than her detail was her scope. This wasn't just a survey of her street or even her neighborhood. To ensure all residents of Oswego would be covered, Mrs. Harris spent the next 3 years walking nearly 100 miles of city sidewalk, documenting each and every potential tripping hazard.
Thousands and thousands of them.
Meet Michael Smith.
Perhaps as many as tens of thousands of them.
Oh, my God.
Michael is the Public Works Director, one of many city officials who received Mrs. Harris's final report.
Did you read them all?
We perused them as best we could.
Well, that means those bastards have just thrown them away.
At this week's Common Council meeting, city officials insisted they haven't thrown them away, while Mrs. Harris insisted they better not have.
If anyone calls on your sidewalks now, you are responsible.
You have to wonder if they all just wish she'd moved to Buffalo. But Mrs. Harris is staying. You should run for mayor.
Yeah,
You thought of that?
yeah.
Look out, Oswego. It's unclear whether her research really does make the city responsible for future falls. I wanted to talk to the Oswego city attorney about it, but Katie, she didn't return my phone calls.
Well, maybe she will now. Meanwhile, go Mrs. Harris. And if she runs for mayor, she's got my vote. She'll have to clean up her language a little, though.
Okay.
Well, I'll campaign for her somehow. Anyway, tell us about next week.
Okay, next week. We'll go back to one of Charles Kuralt's greatest pieces of all time and find out whatever happened to the Chandler family. A wonderful success story that's about to become even more wonderful. That story next week.
All right, looking forward to it. Thanks, Steve. And that is the CBS Evening News for tonight. I'm Katie Couric in New York. Thanks for watching this week. Jeff Glor will be here tomorrow. I'll see you on Monday. Until then, have a great weekend and good night.